What is up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Fellow Show. My name's Kyle. Tonight, we have a fun special video for you guys. I'm going to be kind of reviewing my 2022 draft projections for fantasy football. We're going to go over the top 10 things that I got correct. I'll also upload another top 10 things I got wrong. Probably going to do that tomorrow night. So for now, we're going to have the fun one. It's never fun admitting what you got wrong, but you got to do it at some point. But for now, we're going to hop into a screen share, and then I will show you guys. Well, if you're new to the channel, I do put out fantasy football projections, and I do a draft kit every year. We're going to do the same thing this year. This is probably my fifth or sixth year doing it, I believe. And we're getting better and better each year, a little bit more dialed in. So if you do purchase the draft kit, it does look like this as the cover page, and it's got a table of contents on here. But we'll go over, I'm going to start with quarterbacks. I got a couple quarterbacks and things that I want to talk about. But the first thing that I got right on this top 10 list is going to be Jalen Hurts being a top 5 quarterback. I ended up having him as my number 4 QB, and it was really close at the top of the list here. He ended up being basically almost tied with my number 3, number 4 quarterback. So Jalen Hurts coming in at QB4. Overall, his season, he was QB3 on the year, but he did average the most fantasy points per game on the season with about, if you play in, I guess, your standard 4-point passing touchdown league, he averaged almost 25 points per game, and he missed 2 games, so he's not going to have the total points in his favor, but total points per game, Jalen Hurts was the QB1. And either way, if you were watching my draft content, during the 2022 summer, you probably were drafting Jalen Hurts a lot. He was a guy that we were drafting in the 5th, 6th round, sometimes when he would fall even further. So we love Jalen Hurts. Good luck to him in the Super Bowl as well. He's probably not going to win MVP. That's probably going to be Patrick Mahomes. But man, Jalen Hurts, we absolutely nailed that one. I did get some things wrong in Philadelphia, but overall I knew the offense would flow through Hurts and there'd be good things off of him. So overall, his projection, I guess his final numbers were 3,600 yards, 22 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, 763 rushing yards, and 13 touchdowns. And my projections, I had him at about 3,800 yards. I had him at 24 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, so fairly close there. I had him at about 845 rushing yards and 9 touchdowns. So he exceeded my rushing touchdowns, and then I was a little bit high on his passing yards and passing touchdowns. But overall, we nailed Jalen Hurts. He was a top 5 QB and technically was the number 1 QB all season long. So I guess we'll move on to my number 2 thing I got right here. And in saying so, I got Jalen Hurts absolutely correctly. I projected him highly, and I got rewarded for drafting him. And then there's some guys that I faded. So technically, I'm going to say I got right. Aaron Rodgers and Matthew Stafford, both these guys were not top 10 QBs. They're not top 12 QBs this year. They both had their own different reasons. But for the most part, if you drafted these guys as your QB1, say you waited for a quarterback, in later rounds of your draft, these guys were not the answer. They had a rough year, and I know Matthew Stafford got hurt, but even when he was playing, he wasn't playing very well. He finished with about 12 fantasy points per game through 9 games. He only had 10 touchdowns in that time. Not a good season for Matthew Stafford. He ended up with about a little over 2,000 yards, 10 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, 1 rushing touchdown. But man, 12 fantasy points per game, it was a tough struggle for the Rams pretty much all season long. And you can see he really struggled. He only had 2 games where he threw double-digit or multiple touchdowns, a couple games with no touchdowns. Otherwise, he was just throwing kind of 1 touchdown. Only 1 game over 300 yards. We correctly faded the LA Rams offense with Matthew Stafford. And then the other guy that we kind of faded, who we played better as the year went on as Christian Watson came along, but it was Aaron Rodgers, the back-to-back MVP. He struggled this year on offense, didn't throw the ball very well, working with a lot of young and inefficient receivers. He ended up as being QB13, and that's exactly what we had him as. But I do want to say that we got Jalen Hurts right as our number 1 guy. But Rodgers and Stafford, we were both very low on, and we weren't drafting a lot of them. We weren't excited about their passing options. So those are the quarterback ones. Sure, I could mention a couple other guys. I was right about Trevor Lawrence being a pretty good fantasy quarterback, but we'll cover some more things next. Up next as my number 3 thing I got right, we're going to move to the running back position. And that's going to be Austin Ekeler. I had him as my RB3 going into the year. I was telling people to take him in the top 5. If you took Austin Ekeler, you were probably happier with Ekeler than you would have taken McCaffrey or Taylor or some of the other guys up there. But I had Ekeler as my overall running back number 3. I had him projected for 317 points. And boy, oh boy, did he exceed expectations. Let's see here. He ends up, if I filter it to PPR, he ended up with 378 fantasy points. He scored 18 touchdowns on the year, 107 receptions on a 128 targets. It was just insane. So I was very high on Austin Ekeler and the Chargers going in. If you watched my things that I got wrong video, I'm probably going to admit that I got Justin Herbert wrong. The offense ran through Ekeler, and when they got into the 5-10 yard line range, they were running in for touchdowns. So that's why Herbert's numbers were down a little bit. But either way, if you took Austin Ekeler, you were rewarded with your top 5 pick. He beats Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, and a couple of the other guys here that were taken over him. So well done, great season from Austin Ekeler. Moving on to my number 4. My fourth thing that I got right is going to be Saquon Barkley. Here he finishes as running back number 5 on the year, 1,300 rushing yards, 10 total touchdowns, 57 receptions, 338 receiving yards. No receiving touchdowns, so that's kind of bummer. But overall, fantastic bounce back season for Barkley and the Giants. I actually had him as my RB6 on the season, and my numbers were pretty close. I was a little bit more inflated on the receiving end than his rushing numbers, but he still came in. I had him at 9 touchdowns. He gets 10 touchdowns. I had him at about 15, almost 1,600 total yards, and he did end up with about 1,600 total yards. So my numbers for Saquon Barkley were pretty dialed in. He was the guy that I was taking in round 2 and very happily, especially if I can get him as a running back too. He just looks so appetizing there. So Saquon Barkley, yet another piece that I got right. Very happy with him in my draft returns and him as my RB2. He was more of a guy that I was drafting in best ball leagues because he was falling into the beginning of the second round. So Saquon Barkley and the Giants kind of surprised us this year. Technically, I could put Daniel Jones on a list of people I got wrong. I did have him as a nice quarterback too for fantasy. Nobody expected him to be a fringe top 10, top 12 QB. So we'll kind of let that one go. But Saquon Barkley back to being a top 5 running back on a weekly basis. So you love to see it. And then right after Saquon Barkley, you can see I had Aaron Jones. He's going to be that's my 5th thing that I got right this year. It's going to be Aaron Jones coming in at my running back 7. He actually finished as running back 7 here. So really good season. The touchdowns weren't there. He only scored 7 touchdowns all year. I had him at 12. But he was just hyper efficient with his touches. He had a career year as a receiver for the Packers, ended up with 59 receptions, almost 400 yards and 5 touchdowns. And that's kind of where I had him. If you look at the numbers that I had him for, I had him at 65 receptions, but he did go for 485 yards and 5 touchdowns. I was a bit inflated there. And then his rushing numbers a little bit, he ran for 1,000 yards. I think that was his, was that his first or second season as a 100 or 1,000-yard rusher. It looks like his 3rd season. So Aaron Jones was hyper efficient, another 5 yards per carry season, but just 2 rushing touchdowns on the year. Man, it could have been a much better season for Aaron Jones. But either way, he was another one of those guys. Round 2, we were loving the receivers round 1. So I was, hitting the running backs pretty hard, whether it was Barkley, Aaron Jones, or some of the other guys. But if you took Aaron Jones, I know it was up and down. The Packers offense wasn't very efficient, but it was a very efficient season for Aaron Jones, and he did end up as the RB7, just like we projected. That's enough for running backs. I'll get into some of the ones that I got wrong on the next video, but we'll move on to the wide receivers. And the number 1 thing that I got right here, and I guess this is my 6th thing that I got right. Justin Jefferson. He is the best receiver in football. I had him as my number 1 wide receiver. A lot of people are taking Cooper Kupp as their first wide receiver off the board. I refused to. I think in all my best ball leagues, I was taking Justin Jefferson over him. And fantastic year. The dude, I had him projected for about 1,700 yards, about 113 receptions and 11 touchdowns. He ends up with, let's take a peek. He ended up with 1,800 yards, 128 receptions, and 8 touchdowns. So I actually under-projected him. I had him at 352 points, ends up with 365, so I was pretty spot on there. I do think Cooper Kupp would have been in play for wide receiver 1 had he been healthy, but again, that Rams offense was just not the same. So tip of the hat to Justin Jefferson. He's probably going to be the 1st or 2nd pick in fantasy drafts next year, and we'll continue to love Justin Jefferson. The next thing that I got right, it's going to be number 7 on the list, is CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver 6. So he finishes as wide receiver 6. It's a career year for CeeDee Lamb. I believe he hit highs in receptions, yards, and touchdowns. He also had his 10 carries there, which is nice. But I had him projected as my wide receiver 5. I did have him projected for a career year, but not as good as what I had projected. I had him at 273 fantasy points, and he comes in with 301. So he exceeded expectations. he was one of those guys that you could get round, middle, I guess the back end of round 1, maybe even round 2. I think he was more of a round 2 guy, and he was definitely in play at the first and second round turn. So CeeDee Lamb, another thing that I got right. Again, I had him at wide receiver 5. He finishes as wide receiver 6. Fantastic season for him. Number 8 coming in as the 8th thing that I got right this year. It's going to be Christian Kirk. And I got him right, but I didn't get him right enough. The dude had an amazing year, finished as wide receiver 11 in PPR, 84 catches, 1,108 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Good enough for wide receiver 11. And when I was drafting him, I thought I was too high on him. I had him as wide receiver 22. Now, I had him at 92 receptions, 1,035 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So I was shy a little bit on the touchdowns department. Only had him at 5. Catches 8. I had him at 234 total PPR points, and he ends up with 243. So fantastic year. I was kind of right on the money with Christian Kirk. I was drafting him all day in the 5th, 6th rounds of fantasy drafts to be my wide receiver. Basically, I was getting him as a wide receiver 3, and he ends up being a wide receiver 1. So Christian Kirk, fantastic season with the Jags. And then I'll also tie into that, I guess Trevor Lawrence was a guy that I was pretty dialed into, as well as Zay Jones. So I had a pretty good read on the Jags coming into this season. And yeah, let's move on to I believe it's number 9. So number 9, we faded Deebo Samuel, and I know he had an injury, but you can see here in my projections, I had him as wide receiver 14. People were taking him very, very high as far as like a mid-second round pick to be a wide receiver 1. He was just off my board. I had absolutely no shares of Deebo Samuel this year, and I know he missed some games, but he was all the way down here at wide receiver 36, and technically he only missed 4 games. His points per game were pretty bad, 13.3. It's not fun to be right on a player who you fade, but it does feel good at the same time, because we weren't instead of drafting Deebo Samuel, we were drafting CeeDee Lamb in the 2nd round. So I think that's a huge thing, and it just goes to show that when you're watching my videos and we're looking at who to draft, fading guys is a huge deal. So that's number 9, fading Deebo Samuel. And then the last thing that I got right, and I did get a lot more things right. This is just, again, a top 10 list for the YouTube algorithm to like. But the top, I guess the 10th and final thing that I got right is going to be the tight ends. I'm typically a guy that likes to wait on tight ends. And if you watched my stuff this year, we were drafting Pat Freiermuth, Cole Kmet, David Njoku. These are some of my favorite tight ends to draft in the later rounds. And they all ended up as top 10 tight ends. If we go to my projections here, I had Njoku as tight end 10, Kmet tight end 12, and Pat Freiermuth as tight end 13. And again, the way that I usually draft is if I can't get Kelsey, Andrews, Pitts, Waller, or Kittle at the top, I was waiting for tight ends in the 10th round and grabbing like 2 of them. So having a pair of Njoku and Kmet worked out really, really well for you guys this year if you did so. And I'll probably continue to be a tight end waiter in the drafts here. Again, I like waiting for those guys that could, on a given week, they can catch you a touchdown and make your week. So Njoku, excited about his future with the Browns. Cole Kmet, excited about his future tied with Justin Fields. And then Pat Freiermuth, oh my goodness. At one point during the season, I mean, he was a top 5 tight end. So he was probably the biggest hit among those guys. Only 2 touchdowns, and that could be a lot higher in the future. So waiting on tight end, that's one of my favorite things to do. And yeah, that wraps up the top 10 things that I got right. If you guys have any questions, please let me know in the comments. Again, I'm going to be following up and doing my top 10 things that I got wrong tomorrow night. But yeah, I'm super excited to get into the 2023 stuff. We'll be doing a lot of mock drafts and projection videos the summer of 23. So if you're new to the channel, definitely subscribe. We got everything you need. We're going to get you guys ready for the 2023 fantasy football season. And then from there, we'll have a good time doing it. So again, thanks for your time. Thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your evening. Peace.